All right, everybody, welcome back. Congratulations on finishing your first Section 1 exam. We are going to be moving right along into our next section, which is going to be looking at organismal biology. So, in our first section, we were really talking about the mechanisms by which uh, different populations and different communities develop and interact. And now, what we're going to be doing is looking at the specific arrangement and organization of biology, and specifically how organisms are organized and how they develop. And so that's what we're going to get into today is looking at the tree of life and specifically phylogenetics. So an interesting study that I have an additional video for you guys to watch in the videos is looking at the Galapagos tortoises. Now, for a long time, there was thought that there was only one specific male tortoise of a specific species left in this specific area of the Galapagos. However, using phylogenetics, Dr. Cojone and her lab were able to uh, genotype several different tortoises and was actually able to find a mate for him. And through that was able to create a breeding and conservation program for this species of tortoise. So this is an example of looking at phylogenetics, basically understanding how related one organism is to another organism. And in this case was able to ascertain precisely that these two species were in fact able to reproduce. So that's just an example of phylogenetics and what we're going to be talking about through this section. So the driving questions that we're really going to be thinking about when we think about the tree of life is first of all just the origin of life on Earth and how do we know about it. Secondly, what factors really help explain the distribution of species on Earth? And then lastly, what are the major groups of organisms and how are organisms placed in groups? So again, talking about the organization of biology. So one of the first questions we want to talk about when we're starting to talk about life on Earth is understanding how old the Earth actually is. And interestingly, one of the main reasons why we know a lot about the early origins of Earth is actually from moon rocks. So during the Apollo 17 missions, they had the ambition to actually go up and learn very specifically about the geology of the moon. And what's interesting about the moon is because it doesn't have an atmosphere and because it doesn't have weather and other events, the things that exist on the moon have sort of been in a point of stasis. So it hasn't been changing. And so when NASA conceived of these missions, they started to train astronauts to understand how to do geology, which before there were actually most of the astronauts were engineers or test pilots, so they didn't really necessarily have this background in geological science. And so NASA actually specifically trained astronauts in geology so that they can be able to sample different types of rocks and be able to critically understand different types of rocks that would potentially tell us more about the story of the origins of Earth. And ultimately, the moon was around at sort of the Earth's beginnings because the moon and the proto-Earth crashed into each other and created what we now think of as Earth and its moon. So NASA actually went and they had these geology boot camps where they took astronauts to different areas all over the U.S. and had them trained to say, okay, you would have this much space to observe an area on the moon, collect the rock samples that tell the story, the developmental story of the place that we're at. And through these types of experimental missions, they were able to learn how to think as a geologist would. And from that, we get these really rare rocks, in this case, the Genesis rock. that is basically crust of um, the early some of the earliest crust material that we have from the formation of the Earth and the Moon. And from this, we're actually able to date the Earth to be about 4.5 billion years old. So, thinking more again, and this is just sort of understanding the tools that allow us to understand the origin of Earth. And that is sort of radiometric dating. So, you've probably heard about our ability to use radioactivity present in a rock that is used essentially to be able to date and understand things in geologic time. And we do that using radioactive isotopes. So basically, looking at an unstable element form that decays at a very specific rate, emitting energetic particles, which is what we know as radiation. And so, for example, one of the isotopes that has a very, very long half-life is uranium 238. And eventually, over long, long periods of time, it turns into lead 2.6. And from that, using the information and this very steady decay rate, we're able to assess how old something is based on how much uranium and lead and the proportion between those two exist within a rock. And this is how we're able to do some of the long-term geologic dating that we think about. So this is just an image sort of showing exactly what we're talking about here. So for example, we have like this newly formed rock, and that same rock sometime later is going to have fewer of this specific isotope and more of those, in this example, lead isotopes. And so over time, we're able to really say precisely how old a rock is based on the amount of uranium 238 or lead 206. But again, you have to have the right type of rock and the right crystalline structures in order to do this. Um, but generally speaking, this is how we're able to understand how old things are, particularly in terms of these long scales of geographic time. So this is again just like looking at, so one of those rocks that I was talking about that are very specific are looking at volcanic rock. Um, and so we can actually see, and again, look at this decay rate over billions of years. We can see when this rock was deposited in this layer of ash, and then later we can actually look um, uh, at when each of these rocks were dated. And you can see, again, looking at the proportion, and this is, again, very consistent. And so this is how scientists are really able to understand the age of the Earth and the age of different landmarks throughout the U.S. We're also able to date major events such as volcanic eruptions based on this technology. So now that we know, how we think about dating things in terms of geologic times, let's go back and think through about what we know about life, and specifically, how did life begin on Earth? And we know that this happened around 3 billion years ago, but there's not really discernible evidence of this. But we can sort of start to hypothesize, okay, so, because again, there's not going to be necessarily fossils of like the very, very beginnings of life, but we can actually hypothesize how life came to be and whether or not the materials present on Earth were enough to generate life. And so that's what this very famous experiment of Urey and Miller did in 1953. So they hypothesized that they could actually synthesize organic molecules by replicating the chemical environment on early Earth. So basically, within these test tubes, they put all of the elements that you see in early Earth's history and used essentially electricity to mimic a lightning strike. And from that, he was actually able to synthesize organic materials. So this is sort of known as the primordial soup experiment. Um, and what was remarkable about this experiment was the result was amino acids, which were these very early building blocks of life, amino acids that create proteins. And so from this experiment, it showed that it was possible to actually create molecules of life from inorganic materials. And you have an additional talk about how scientists now are sort of hypothesizing how life generated that I'd like you to watch after this, because it's really interesting that we initially sort of thought of these early life coming from these primordial soups, but where do primordial soups happen on Earth? And where was likely the beginning of that? So that's going to be sort of the next video I'd like you to watch. Okay, and I will see you back for part 2.